The city of Crestwood was alive with its usual buzz. Cars honked impatiently on congested streets, street vendors shouted their wares to passers-by, and the faint hum of distant construction filled the air. Amidst all this chaos, a small courtroom sat tucked away in the corner of an old courthouse building. It wasn't particularly grand or modern. Just 4 walls painted beige, rows of wooden benches that creaked under pressure, and a raised platform where Judge Harold Grayson presided, over cases ranging from parking tickets to petty theft. Today, however, something unusual had drawn attention to courtroom B12. A young girl named Maya, a 14-year-old black schoolgirl, was sitting nervously at the defendant's table. Her backpack rested against her chair, bulging with notebooks and pens. She wore oversized glasses that made her look younger than she already was, and her neatly braided hair framed a face that seemed too calm for someone about to face a judge. Maya didn't belong here. At least, that's what most people thought when they saw her. To them, she looked like any other teenager who might have gotten into trouble for breaking rules. Perhaps she'd snuck out past curfew or been caught shoplifting candy, but no one imagined the real reason she was there. Vandalism. Charges for graffiti sprayed across the walls of her middle school. The prosecutor, Lisa Monroe, stood confidently near the front of the room. She adjusted her blazer as she glanced at Maya, smirking slightly. To Monroe, this case was practically gift-wrapped. The evidence was solid, or so she believed, and the defendant was just a kid. What chance did Maya have against the full weight of the law? Meanwhile, Mr. Phillips, Maya's court-appointed attorney, fidgeted uncomfortably in his seat. He was a decent man, but not exactly known for winning tough cases. His tie was crooked, his notes disorganized, and his brow furrowed with anxiety. He kept glancing at Maya, hoping she'd say something reassuring. Instead, she remained silent, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. Judge Grayson entered the room then, interrupting everyone's thoughts. He was a tall man with thinning gray hair and a stern expression that rarely softened. Known for his unconventional methods, he often surprised both lawyers and defendants alike. Today would be no exception. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Grayson began, addressing the packed courtroom, "we are gathered here today to determine whether Ms. Maya Johnson is guilty of malicious property damage." He paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. Then, without warning, he added, "But instead of following our usual procedures, I've decided we're going to try something new." A murmur rippled through the crowd. People leaned forward in their seats, curious about what the judge meant. Even Prosecutor Monroe raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. "We'll play a little game called Truth or Lie," Judge Grayson announced, his voice carrying authority. "Each side will take turns making statements related to the case. The opposing party must then decide if the statement is true or false. Whoever guesses correctly scores a point. If the prosecution wins, the defendant is found guilty. If the defense wins..." He trailed off, allowing the implication to hang in the air. For a moment, the room fell silent. No one dared to breathe. This was unprecedented, unorthodox even by Judge Grayson's standards. Some spectators exchanged skeptical glances while others whispered excitedly to their neighbors. Was this really happening? Prosecutor Monroe recovered quickly, flashing a confident smile. She liked games, especially ones she thought she could win. After all, how hard could it be to outsmart a child? Turning to her assistant, she whispered instructions, preparing her opening move. Mr. Phillips, on the other hand, looked like he might faint. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he turned to Maya. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. "We can't possibly..." Maya interrupted him with a soft but firm voice. "It's okay, Mr. Phillips. Let me handle this." Her words startled him. He blinked rapidly, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. Handle it? How could a 14-year-old handle anything in a courtroom, let alone a bizarre game invented by Judge Grayson? Still, there was something in her tone, a quiet assurance, that made him hesitate. For reasons he couldn't explain, he nodded and sat back, deciding to trust her instincts. Maya exhaled slowly, her heart pounding but her mind sharp. She'd spent years studying law books borrowed from the library after school. While other kids played video games or scrolled through social media, Maya immersed herself in legal theories, landmark cases, and courtroom strategies. She knew the ins and outs of criminal procedure better than most adults twice her age. And, now sitting in this courtroom, she felt a strange sense of excitement. This wasn't just a challenge. It was an opportunity to prove herself. Judge Grayson banged his gavel, signaling the start of the proceedings. "Ms. Monroe," he said, gesturing toward the prosecutor, "you may begin." Monroe stepped forward, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. She cleared her throat dramatically before delivering her first statement. "Your Honor, the graffiti found on the school wall matches fingerprints lifted from the scene, which belonged to the defendant." The room grew tense. Several jurors scribbled notes, nodding along as if convinced. It sounded damning, a clear link between Maya and the crime. Surely the defense wouldn't dare call it a lie. Mr. Phillips opened his mouth to respond but froze, panic written all over his face. Once again, Maya leaned over and whispered softly. He listened intently, his eyes widening as understanding dawned. Slowly, he straightened up and declared, "Lie." Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. Heads turned to stare at Maya, who sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable. Prosecutor Monroe frowned, clearly unprepared for such a bold response. She crossed her arms and demanded, "Care to elaborate?" Maya stood up then, surprising everyone. She adjusted her glasses and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "Your Honor, while it's true that my fingerprints were found on the wall, there's no proof those prints were left during the act of vandalism. I touched that wall weeks ago during a class project. Fingerprints alone don't prove guilt." The judge leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully. He hadn't expected this level of reasoning from a child. Finally, he nodded and addressed the courtroom. "The prosecution needs more concrete evidence to support their claim." Point awarded to the defense. Whispers erupted around the room. Some spectators were impressed by Maya's quick thinking, while others dismissed it as beginner's luck. But Maya wasn't paying attention to any of them. She simply sat back down, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. This was only the beginning. As the first round came to a close, Prosecutor Monroe clenched her fists tightly. She hadn't anticipated such resistance from a mere teenager. Across the aisle, Mr. Phillips stared at Maya in awe, realizing he'd underestimated her completely. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Maya Johnson was not your average defendant, and neither was this your average trial. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Judge Grayson adjusted his glasses, studying Maya carefully. No one could quite believe what had just happened. A 14-year-old girl, a defendant accused of vandalism, had outsmarted the prosecutor in the first round of this bizarre game. But it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Prosecutor Lisa Monroe clenched her jaw, visibly irritated. She hadn't expected such resistance from someone so young. To her, this case should have been simple: present the evidence, secure a conviction, and move on. But now, thanks to Maya's clever rebuttal, the prosecution was behind by a point. And Lisa Monroe didn't like losing. She glanced at Maya again, sizing her up. The girl sat calmly at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her oversized glasses reflected the fluorescent lights above, making it hard to read her expression. To Lisa, Maya looked like any other kid, quiet, maybe even shy, but there was something unsettling about her composure. It was almost as if she knew something no one else did. "All right," Judge Grayson said, breaking the silence. "Round 2 begins. Ms. Monroe, your statement." Lisa stepped forward confidently, smoothing her blazer. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsing her arguments the night before. This time, she wouldn't leave anything to chance. Clearing her throat, she declared loudly, "Witness testimony places the defendant near the scene of the crime around the time it occurred." The room fell silent. Jurors exchanged glances, scribbling notes furiously. Several spectators whispered among themselves, nodding along as if convinced. After all, eyewitness accounts were powerful. If someone saw Maya near the school late at night, that would be damning evidence indeed. Mr. Phillips shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He turned to Maya, expecting her to panic or at least hesitate. Instead, she simply leaned over and whispered something into his ear. Whatever she said made him sit up straighter, his eyes widening slightly. Slowly, he nodded and stood up, addressing the judge. "Truth," Mr. Phillips announced, his voice wavering only slightly. Lisa Monroe raised an eyebrow, surprised but pleased. By admitting the statement was true, the defense had essentially conceded that Maya had been near the school when the vandalism took place. That was progress, a step closer to securing a guilty verdict. But before she could bask in her small victory, Maya spoke up. "Your Honor," Maya began, standing up without waiting for permission. Her voice was calm but firm, commanding attention. "While it's true that I was near the school that night, proximity does not equal culpability. Just because I was there doesn't mean I committed the crime. If we followed that logic, anyone walking past the school could be accused of vandalism." Her words hung in the air, leaving the courtroom stunned. Even Judge Grayson seemed taken aback. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "Explain yourself further, Miss Johnson," he said, intrigued. Maya nodded politely and continued. "Studies show that eyewitness testimony is often unreliable. People can misremember details, especially under stress or after some time has passed. Without additional evidence linking me directly to the act of vandalism, relying solely on witness statements isn't enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." As she spoke, several jurors exchanged uneasy looks. One woman frowned deeply, flipping through her notes. Another man scratched his head, clearly reconsidering his earlier assumptions. Prosecutor Monroe, meanwhile, felt her confidence waver. She hadn't anticipated Maya being so articulate or so knowledgeable about legal principles. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly against the desk. "Miss Johnson raises valid points," he said, addressing the courtroom. "Eyewitness testimony alone cannot serve as conclusive proof. Therefore, the defense retains its lead." The crowd erupted into whispers once again. Some people applauded quietly, impressed by Maya's reasoning. Others muttered disapprovingly, believing she was merely playing games with the system. But Maya didn't care about their opinions. She cared about fairness and exposing the flaws in the prosecution's argument. Prosecutor Monroe returned to her seat, fuming silently. She glanced at her assistant, who offered a sympathetic shrug. They needed to regroup, to find a way to counter Maya's unexpected brilliance. But how? How do you argue with someone who seems to know more about the law than you do, across the aisle? Mr. Phillips couldn't stop staring at Maya. He had always thought of himself as competent, if not particularly brilliant. Yet here was a teenage girl dismantling the prosecution's case, piece by piece, using logic and facts that most adults wouldn't even think of. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely inspired. "Well done," he whispered to Maya as they sat back down. "You handled that perfectly." Maya smiled faintly but kept her focus on the judge. "Thank you, Mr. Phillips," she replied softly. "But we're not done yet. We still need to stay sharp." Round 3. Rising Tensions. With the second round complete, the tension in the courtroom reached new heights. Both sides knew the stakes were high. If the defense won another round, they'd secure Maya's freedom. If the prosecution managed to turn things around, they could still walk away victorious. "Ms. Monroe," Judge Grayson called out, gesturing toward the prosecutor. "Your next statement." Lisa stood up again, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She took a deep breath, determined to regain control of the situation. Pulling out a folder from her briefcase, she flipped it open and held up a document for everyone to see. "This security footage," she announced dramatically, "shows the defendant entering the school grounds late at night. The timestamp confirms she was present during the exact time frame when the vandalism occurred." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Spectators craned their necks to get a better look at the grainy black and white video displayed on a screen nearby. In it, a figure resembling Maya could be seen walking toward the school building, backpack slung over one shoulder. The timestamp in the corner clearly indicated the date and time of the alleged crime. For a moment, Maya's calm demeanor faltered. She stared at the screen, her brow furrowing slightly. Even Mr. Phillips looked defeated, slumping back in his chair. How could they possibly refute such damning evidence? The video appeared to seal Maya's fate, but then, to everyone's astonishment, Maya regained her composure. Straightening her spine, she stood up once again and addressed the judge. "Lie," she declared firmly. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, cameras flashed wildly, and voices rose in disbelief. How could Maya deny what was right in front of them? The video seemed irrefutable. Judge Grayson banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. When the noise finally subsided, he turned to Maya, his expression unreadable. "Miss Johnson, you've declared the prosecution's statement false. Please explain your reasoning." Maya nodded respectfully. Reaching into her own backpack, she pulled out a USB drive and handed it to the bailiff. "Your Honor, I've analyzed the metadata of the video file," she explained, her voice steady. "The timestamp was digitally altered. The original recording shows that the person in the video entered the school hours before the vandalism took place, not during the act itself." Lisa Monroe froze, her face draining of color. She glanced at her assistant, who shook his head frantically. They hadn't anticipated Maya having access to such technical expertise, or the audacity to challenge their evidence so boldly. Judge Grayson examined the USB drive closely, his brow furrowed. After a few moments, he turned to the courtroom. "It appears Miss Johnson has uncovered significant inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence. Until these discrepancies are resolved, the defense retains its lead." The crowd erupted once again, this time with cheers and applause. People clapped for Maya, amazed by her intelligence and determination. Even some of the jurors smiled approvingly, clearly impressed by her performance. Prosecutor Monroe sank into her seat, defeated. She realized too late that she had underestimated Maya and paid the price for it. Across the aisle, Maya sat back, down, her expression calm but resolute. She wasn't celebrating yet. There was still work to be done. And though the trial wasn't over, one thing was clear. Maya Johnson was proving to be far more than anyone had expected. To be continued. The courtroom was alive with tension, a palpable energy that crackled through the air like static electricity. The prosecution's once confident stance had faltered after Maya exposed the tampered security footage. Prosecutor Lisa Monroe sat stiffly in her seat, her blazer now feeling suffocating rather than professional. Her assistant flipped frantically through papers, searching for anything that could salvage their case. But every glance at Maya only deepened their unease. Maya, on the other hand, remained calm and collected. She leaned slightly forward in her chair, her hands clasped loosely on the table in front of her. Her oversized glasses caught the light as she adjusted them, giving her an almost scholarly appearance. To anyone watching, she looked less like a defendant and more like someone conducting research or solving puzzles. And in many ways, that's exactly what she was doing. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to him. "We have reached the final round," he announced, his voice carrying authority despite the chaos swirling around him. "Both sides will present one last statement. The outcome of this game, and the verdict, will depend on your responses. Prosecutor." Monroe rose slowly, her movements deliberate but tinged with desperation. She knew this was her last chance to turn the tide. Pulling out a folder from her briefcase, she opened it and held up a photograph for the court to see. It depicted the graffiti-covered wall of the school, bold red letters spelling out phrases that seemed angry and defiant. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but edged with frustration. "This graffiti contains specific references to events and individuals within the school community. Only someone familiar with those details could have created it. The defendant, being a student at the school, had access to this information. Therefore, it is reasonable to conclude that she is responsible." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Spectators exchanged glances, nodding along as if convinced by Monroe's argument. Even some jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, reconsidering their earlier doubts. After all, who else would know such intimate details about the school, unless they were directly involved? Mr. Phillips glanced nervously at Maya, unsure how to respond. He had seen her dismantle the prosecution's previous arguments, but this one felt different, more personal, harder to refute. For a moment, panic flickered across his face, but Maya didn't flinch. Without hesitation, she stood up and addressed the judge directly. "Truth," she said firmly, her voice ringing clear across the room. The courtroom fell silent. Everyone turned to stare at her, disbelief etched onto their faces. Had she just admitted guilt? Was this the end of her defense? Before anyone could react, Maya continued. "It's true that I am familiar with the school community and its issues. Many students are frustrated with the way things are run. The lack of resources, the unfair punishments, the favoritism shown to certain groups over others. These problems exist, and they affect all of us." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But knowing about these issues doesn't make me guilty of vandalism. If anything, my awareness of them motivates me to seek change, not through destruction, but through dialogue and action. I've been part of student council meetings, organizing petitions and speaking up for fairness. That's why I'm here today, to fight for justice, not because I committed a crime." Her speech sent shockwaves through the room. Some spectators nodded approvingly, while others whispered among themselves, debating whether her explanation made sense. Even Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He tapped his gavel lightly against the bench, signaling for silence. "Miss Johnson raises an interesting point," he said, addressing the courtroom. "Awareness of a problem does not imply involvement in its manifestation. Ms. Monroe, do you have any evidence directly linking the defendant to the act of creating the graffiti?" Monroe hesitated, her confidence wavering. She glanced at her notes, then at the photo in her hand, before finally shaking her head. Not conclusively, Your Honor," she admitted reluctantly. Judge Grayson nodded gravely. "Then the defense retains its lead. However, there is one final statement to be made. Miss Johnson, your turn." Maya's final move. Maya took a deep breath, her heart pounding but her mind sharp. This was her moment, the culmination of everything she'd learned, everything she believed in. Slowly, she approached the bench, her backpack slung over one shoulder. From it, she pulled out a thick binder filled with neatly organized documents, charts, and photographs. "Your Honor," she began, her voice confident yet respectful, "I'd like to present additional evidence supporting my innocence. First, let's consider motive. The prosecution claims I vandalized the school due to dissatisfaction with its policies. However, during the week in question, I was actively working on a project aimed at improving school conditions. Here are emails between me and my teacher, outlining our plans." She handed the emails to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. As Judge Grayson reviewed them, murmurs spread throughout the courtroom. Several jurors leaned forward, intrigued by the level of detail in Maya's preparation. "Secondly," Maya continued, "there is no physical evidence placing me at the scene during the actual act of vandalism. Fingerprints can be explained by prior contact with the wall, and the video footage has already been proven unreliable. Furthermore, 2 classmates have confirmed seeing me leave the school grounds hours before the graffiti appeared. Their statements are included in this binder." Lisa Monroe bristled visibly, her frustration boiling over. "Objection, Your Honor," she exclaimed, standing abruptly. "These statements weren't disclosed during discovery. They shouldn't be admissible now." Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, considering her objection. Then he turned to Maya. "Miss Johnson, is this true? Were these statements withheld intentionally?" Maya shook her head calmly. "No, Your Honor, I submitted them to my attorney weeks ago, but they were overlooked. I apologize for the oversight, but I believe the truth should still come to light." Judge Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples. "Given the circumstances, I'll allow it. Continue, Miss Johnson." Maya nodded gratefully and pressed on. "Finally, I want to address the graffiti itself. While I agree that it reflects genuine concerns within the school community, I also believe it was created by someone seeking attention rather than meaningful change. If given permission, I'd like to propose a solution: forming a committee to address student grievances constructively, instead of resorting to destructive behavior." Her words resonated deeply with several jurors, who exchanged approving nods. Even Prosecutor Monroe seemed momentarily speechless, unable to counter Maya's logic. The verdict approaches. As Maya returned to her seat, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. People whispered excitedly, speculating about the outcome. Some reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, eager to capture every detail of this unprecedented trial. Judge Grayson banged his gavel sharply, demanding order. When the room finally quieted, he addressed both sides. "This has been a most unusual case," he admitted, his tone reflective. "Miss Johnson, you've demonstrated remarkable knowledge of the law and an unwavering commitment to fairness. Ms. Monroe, you've presented compelling arguments, but unfortunately, the evidence falls short of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." He paused, surveying the courtroom one last time before delivering his verdict. "Based on the rules of this game and the principles of justice, I find the defendant, Miss Maya Johnson, not guilty." The room erupted into applause. Spectators clapped loudly, some even cheering. Reporters scrambled to interview Maya, cameras flashing wildly, but she simply smiled faintly, gathering her belongings and standing up to leave. Outside the courthouse, Maya was greeted by her grandmother, who hugged her tightly. "You did good, baby," Grandma said proudly, tears glistening in her eyes. "Real good." Maya shrugged modestly, adjusting her glasses. "It's not about winning, Grandma. It's about making sure people understand the truth and fighting for what's right." As they walked away together, Maya glanced back at the courthouse one last time. She knew this wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. Someday she hoped to become a lawyer, using her skills to help others navigate the complexities of the legal system. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, Maya felt ready. After all, she had already proven that intelligence, determination, and courage knew no age limits. To be continued. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Judge Grayson delivered his verdict. Reporters scrambled to capture every moment, their cameras flashing like strobe lights in the dimly lit room. Maya stood quietly by her seat, her expression calm but resolute. She wasn't celebrating, she didn't feel triumphant. For her, this wasn't about winning. It was about exposing the truth and proving that justice could prevail when people were willing to fight for it. Prosecutor Lisa Monroe looked pale and defeated. Her carefully constructed case had crumbled under Maya's relentless logic and preparation. She glanced at her assistant, who avoided eye contact altogether. The weight of what had happened, the tampered video, the unreliable witness statements, the overlooked emails, was sinking in. Monroe realized too late that she'd underestimated Maya from the start. Judge Grayson banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. "Quiet," he barked, his voice cutting through the noise. Slowly, the commotion died down, leaving behind an uneasy silence. He turned to Prosecutor Monroe, his expression stern. "Ms. Monroe, I need an explanation regarding the altered security footage." Monroe hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the prosecutor's table. She opened her mouth to speak but found no words coming out. Instead, she glanced nervously at her assistant, who whispered something inaudible into her ear. Finally, Monroe straightened up and addressed the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaky, "I admit there were inconsistencies in the evidence presented. However, these discrepancies were not introduced by my office. We relied on materials provided by the school administration, who assured us of their authenticity." The room fell silent again. Everyone turned to stare. At Monroe, disbelief etched onto their faces. The school administration? Were they involved in tampering with evidence? Judge Grayson leaned forward, his brow furrowed deeply. "Are you telling me," he asked slowly, emphasizing each word, "that your office knowingly used, potentially, falsified evidence in this trial?" Monroe flinched visibly. "Not knowingly, Your Honor. But yes, we failed to verify the integrity of the materials before presenting them." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even seasoned lawyers exchanged shocked glances. Using tampered evidence, even unintentionally, was a serious breach of ethics. To many present, it seemed unthinkable that such negligence could occur in a court of law. Maya watched silently, her gaze fixed on the prosecutor. She felt no anger, only a deep sense of resolve. This was why she had fought so hard. Not just to clear her name, but to expose the flaws in a system that often prioritized convenience over fairness. If left unchecked, those flaws could ruin lives. Judge Grayson sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. "This is unacceptable," he declared firmly. "Ms. Monroe, I expect a full investigation into how this evidence was handled, and I will personally oversee the matter to ensure accountability." Monroe nodded mutely, her face flushed with embarrassment. Whatever confidence she had entered the courtroom with was now completely shattered. As she returned to her seat, she couldn't help but glance at Maya one last time. The young girl's quiet composure unnerved her. How could someone so young possess such poise and such power? A deeper truth comes to light. As the formalities wrapped up, Judge Grayson addressed the jurors. "Ladies and gentlemen, while this case has concluded, it raises important questions about our justice system. Eyewitness testimony, digital evidence, and even institutional practices must be scrutinized rigorously. Justice cannot exist without transparency." His words resonated deeply with the jurors, who nodded solemnly. One woman wiped tears from her eyes, clearly moved by the day's events. Another juror scribbled notes furiously, determined to share what he'd learned with others. Meanwhile, reporters surrounded Maya and Mr. Phillips, firing questions rapidly. "How did you uncover the tampered video? What inspired you to study law at such a young age? Do you plan to pursue a career in law?" Mr. Phillips tried to shield Maya from the barrage of questions, stepping in front of her protectively. "That's enough," he said firmly, raising his hand. "Miss Johnson has endured enough today. Please respect her privacy." But Maya stepped forward, surprising everyone. She adjusted her glasses and faced the reporters calmly. "Thank you for your interest," she began, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "I didn't uncover the tampered video alone. I worked with friends who understand technology better than I do. Together, we analyzed the metadata and found irregularities." She paused, letting her words sink in. "As for studying law, I've always believed in fairness. When I saw televised trials, I wanted to learn how the system worked so I could help people who might not have a voice. And yes, I hope to become a lawyer someday, but not because I want fame. I want to make sure everyone gets a fair chance no matter who they are." Her response earned applause from the crowd. Some reporters jotted down her quotes eagerly, while others filmed her reaction. Despite the attention, Maya remained composed, her focus unwavering. The school administration's role. While the media frenzy continued outside the courthouse, whispers spread about the school administration's involvement in the tampered evidence. A local news station broke the story later that evening, revealing that the principal had pressured staff members to secure a conviction against Maya. According to sources within the school, the vandalism had caused significant backlash from parents and board members, leading administrators to panic. They needed someone to blame, one anonymous teacher told reporters. Maya was an easy target because she's outspoken and unafraid to challenge authority. They thought framing her would solve their problems quickly. The revelation sent shockwaves through Crestwood. Parents demanded answers, students organized protests, and community leaders called for accountability. By morning, the story had gone viral, sparking debates across social media platforms about systemic biases and institutional misconduct. For Maya, the uproar confirmed what she already knew. The system wasn't perfect, but it also showed her that change was possible if people were willing to stand up and demand it. Reflections on justice. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Grayson dismissed the jury and adjourned the session. As he gathered his papers, he couldn't shake the image of Maya standing confidently before him, dismantling arguments with ease. He had seen countless defendants pass through his courtroom, but none had impressed him quite like her. "She's remarkable," he muttered to himself, shaking his head in admiration. Then turning to Mr. Phillips, who lingered nearby, he added, "Take care of her, counselor. That girl has a bright future ahead of her." Mr. Phillips smiled faintly, still reeling from the whirlwind of events. "I'll try, Your Honor," he replied. "But honestly, I think she'll take care of herself and maybe even the rest of us." Outside, Maya joined her grandmother, who hugged her tightly once again. "You made me proud today," Grandma said softly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "So proud." Maya hugged her back, feeling a rare moment of peace amidst the storm. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to relax, knowing she had done everything she could to prove her innocence, and more importantly, to expose the truth. But as they walked away from the courthouse together, Maya couldn't help but glance back one last time. She knew this victory was just the beginning. There would be more battles to fight, more injustices to address, and more voices to amplify. And she was ready. Because for Maya Johnson, justice wasn't just a concept. It was a calling. To be continued. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across Crestwood as Maya and her grandmother made their way home from the courthouse. The streets were quieter now, though echoes of the day's events still lingered in the air. News vans lined the roads outside the school. Reporters huddled together exchanging updates about the scandal. For many residents, it was hard to believe that such a small case involving a 14-year-old girl had exposed cracks in the foundation of their community. Maya walked silently beside her grandmother, her mind racing despite the calmness she projected. She felt relief, undeniable relief, but also a sense of responsibility. Today's victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who believed in fairness and accountability. Yet as much as she wanted to celebrate, she couldn't shake the weight of what lay ahead. The fight for justice didn't end with one trial or one verdict. It was ongoing, relentless, and often thankless. Her grandmother noticed the faraway look in Maya's eyes and squeezed her hand gently. "You did good today, baby," Grandma said softly, breaking the silence. "Don't let all this noise get to your head." Maya nodded, offering a faint smile. "I know, Grandma, but there's so much more we need to fix. This isn't over yet." The fallout. Back at the courthouse, Judge Harold Grayson sat alone in his chambers, staring at the stack of papers before him. He hadn't expected the trial to unfold the way it had, or for a child to teach him something about integrity. As he reflected on the day's events, he realized how easily assumptions could cloud judgment. Maya had walked into the courtroom, looking like any other teenager caught up in trouble. He had underestimated her, just as prosecutor Lisa Monroe had. Now, he vowed never to make that mistake again. On the other side of town, Lisa Monroe sat slumped in her office chair, staring blankly at her computer screen. Her career hung in the balance. Using tampered evidence, even unintentionally, was a serious offense, and the fallout was already beginning. Calls poured in from angry superiors demanding explanations, while emails from colleagues expressed disappointment. Some even hinted at disciplinary action. But what weighed most heavily on Monroe's conscience was the realization that she had been complicit in perpetuating injustice. She had accepted evidence without verifying its authenticity, because it fit neatly into her narrative. In doing so, she had failed not only Maya but also the very system she swore to uphold. As the hours passed, Monroe found herself replaying moments from the trial in her mind. Maya's calm demeanor, her sharp reasoning, her unwavering focus, it all haunted her. How had a 14-year-old managed to outwit seasoned professionals? And more importantly, why hadn't anyone stopped to question whether they were pursuing the right person? By evening, Monroe made a decision. She drafted a formal letter of apology to Maya and her family, taking full responsibility for her role in the flawed prosecution. Then, she sent an email to her supervisor, requesting an independent review of her handling of the case. Whether it salvaged her reputation remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. She owed it to herself and to the public to set things right. The school administration under fire. Meanwhile, the school administration faced mounting pressure from parents, students, and community leaders. Protests erupted outside the school gates with students holding signs that read, "Stop blaming us," and "We deserve better leadership." Teachers joined the demonstrations, voicing concerns about the lack of transparency and accountability within the institution. At the center of the controversy stood Principal Robert Harris, whose actions during the investigation came under intense scrutiny. Anonymous sources revealed that Harris had pressured staff members to falsify documents implicating Maya, believing it would quell parental outrage over the vandalism. His desperation to protect the school's image had backfired spectacularly, turning a minor incident into a citywide scandal. By nightfall, the school board convened an emergency meeting to address the crisis. After hours of heated debate, they voted unanimously to suspend Harris pending further investigation. In a press release issued shortly afterward, the board promised sweeping reforms to restore trust in the school system. For Maya, the news brought mixed emotions. On one hand, she felt vindicated knowing that those responsible for framing her would face consequences. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the damage done to her peers, the mistrust sown between students and teachers, the fear of speaking out against authority. It would take time and effort to heal those wounds. A new beginning. Days turned into weeks, and life in Crestwood slowly returned to normal, or at least as close to normal as possible after such upheaval. Maya became a local hero, celebrated for her courage and intellect. Invitations poured in from schools and organizations eager to hear her speak about perseverance and justice. Reporters continued to follow her story, fascinated by her maturity and determination. Despite the attention, Maya remained grounded. She declined most interview requests, focusing instead on finishing the school year and preparing for high school. Her dream of becoming a lawyer burned brighter than ever, fueled by the lessons she'd learned during the trial. Every setback, every challenge had reinforced her belief that change was possible if people were willing to stand up and demand it. One afternoon, Maya sat at her desk, poring over law books borrowed from the library. Notes covered the pages highlighting key cases and legal principles. Her grandmother peeked into the room, smiling fondly at the sight of her granddaughter buried in study materials. "You're going to be great, you know that?" Grandma said, leaning against the doorway. Maya looked up, startled out of her thoughts. "Thanks, Grandma," she replied, grinning sheepishly, "but I've got a long way to go." Grandma shook her head. "Not as long as you think. You've already proven yourself, baby. Just keep being who you are." Maya nodded, returning to her notes. She knew her journey wouldn't be easy. Law school would be challenging, and the legal profession demanded resilience and sacrifice, but she was ready. For every obstacle she faced, she reminded herself of the day she stood in that courtroom, not just as a defendant, but as a voice for truth and fairness. Judge Grayson's legacy. In the months following the trial, Judge Grayson implemented changes in his courtroom procedures to prevent similar incidents from occurring. He introduced mandatory training, sessions for attorneys on ethical practices and evidence verification. Additionally, he began mentoring young students interested in law, hoping to inspire the next generation of legal minds. During one such session, a group of middle schoolers visited his courtroom. As they sat in the jury box, wide-eyed and curious, Grayson shared stories from his career, including the unforgettable trial of Maya Johnson. "She taught me something important," he told them, his voice warm with admiration. "Never underestimate someone based on appearances. Intelligence, courage, and integrity can come from anyone, regardless of age or background." The students listened intently, inspired by his words. One boy raised his hand hesitantly. "Do you think I could become a judge someday?" he asked. Grayson smiled. "Absolutely. If you work hard and stay true to your values, anything is possible." Epilogue. A seed planted. Years later, Maya graduated top of her class from law school, earning accolades for her dedication to civil rights and juvenile justice reform. Her first major case involved representing a group of teenagers wrongfully accused of theft, a situation eerily reminiscent of her own experience. With precision and passion, she dismantled the prosecution's arguments, securing acquittals for all her clients. As she left the courtroom that day, a reporter approached her with a familiar question. "What inspired you to become a lawyer?" Maya paused, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. "I wanted to give a voice to those who feel powerless," she said finally, adjusting her glasses. "Justice isn't just about winning cases, it's about making sure everyone gets a fair shot, no matter who they are." With that, she walked away, her steps steady and purposeful. Behind her, the seeds of change continued to grow, planted by a brave 14-year-old girl who refused to back down when the odds were stacked against her. And somewhere in Crestwood, Judge Harold Grayson watched proudly, knowing the world was in good hands. The end.